And welcome. We're so glad to have all of you here. And I want to also welcome Rabbi Cohen. I'm Keshet Starr. I'm the CEO of Shalom Task Force, and I am thrilled to be here with Rabbi Aaron Cohen, who is a rabbinic consultant to Shalom Task Force, also the Rav of Tifereth Israel in Passaic, also a licensed clinical social worker and a teacher at Starr. And I could keep going, but I know we have a lot to discuss. So I think Rabbi Cohen, we're so fortunate to have you here with both your halachic expertise as well as that social work piece. And I always find it fascinating when halacha and the messiness of human beings in the world trying to figure it all out really comes together. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'll share just a quick housekeeping note, which is that we welcome your questions. On the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A button with a little question mark. Please put your questions in there. We will keep an eye on them. If they fit with what we're discussing, we'll make sure to loop them into our conversation. And otherwise, we're hoping to leave some time for questions at the end. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And you're also welcome to post on the chat if you have any tech issues or anything else that's not working on your end. So before we jump in, I wanted to really frame why we're having this conversation. As many of you probably know, at Shalom Task Force, our mission is to combat and prevent abuse and also to really foster healthy relationships in the Jewish community. And often in the course of our work, we're seeing really tough abuse situations that are far into the process where there's a lot of support needed, and we're really honored to be able to help. However, if we can prevent as much suffering from happening before it happens, that's really our ultimate goal. And that's what brings us to really wanting to talk about dating, about Shidduchim, and about how we can make sure that all the people in our lives that we know and love are really set up for success in building strong and happy and healthy relationships. And one of the questions that we get a lot is how we handle reference calls when it comes to Shidduchim. And what I find hard about this is that sometimes it's a very formal, call on the phone with someone checking a reference. And sometimes it's going for a walk with a friend while they say, oh, what do you know about this person? I want to set them up. And there is a really delicate balance between not wanting to say something that might torpedo a relationship that, who knows, maybe that could be a wonderful relationship. And at the same time, wanting to make sure that we're not leading people into situations where they're going to get hurt. And of course, as Jews, we also have halacha to guide us in terms of what to say, what not to say, how to say it, who should say it, all of the above. So what we're going to do now is dig into the nitty-gritty, really talking about Lashon Hara, about our speech, about when we have a responsibility to speak, when we have a responsibility not to speak, and how to go about the conversations that we have on dating and Shidduchim really with thoughtfulness and clarity in terms of what we're here to do. So thank you, Rabbi Cohen, for joining me.
Pleasure.
And in order to start us off, I really wanted to really start broadly and think what are sort of the basic operating principles that we should be thinking about when it comes to this topic.
Okay. So first of all, I think we have to appreciate the complexity involved. This is a topic with so many different variables. Each situation is going to be different and has to be assessed on its own. And given that it's bein adam lechaveiro issue, therefore each, again, scenario has to be assessed because there are different people, there are different sensitivities, there are different expectations in each circumstance. So you can't really give a simple set of black and white rules. I want to note that even what I'm going to say tonight shouldn't be taken as uniform, accepted psak. You can have variation amongst different rabbanim and poskim. Regard to this, I'm going to try to give what I've seen as the kind of mainstream approach in regard to this. But obviously, I'm going to say again and again, people should seek out rabbinic guidance. But in addition to the halachos, and there are halachos, there are very definitely halachos that guide us in regard to this, but there are also what I would call priorities and values and guidelines that emerge from those halachos that have to be applied carefully. And because it's an area of ben adam lechaveru with so many variables, you absolutely need, it's essential to apply good judgment. Now that sounds, I don't know if it sounds simplistic, but it is critical because in each and every case, you have to figure out and assess what is necessary, what's appropriate, how to apply the particular halachos, guidelines, and values to that particular circumstance. So, therefore, just looping back to something I said before, you need a Rav involved, almost always, someone who gives those kinds of guidelines. Sometimes I've seen this myself. I will reach out to Rabbeim and poskim in order sometimes to navigate these kinds of issues. And also at times you need to consult with professionals because what we would call assessing the mitzias, the actual understanding the situation that we're presented with in a particular scenario, sometimes requires professional judgment and assessment as well.
Thank you so much. And I think so much of what makes this tricky is that it would be easier if it was a choose your own adventure. If it's X, you do Y, and if it's B, you do Z. And I do think that element of judgment is really powerful and really difficult. So the bad news is there aren't these clear and obvious pathways, but the good news is that the more we know about the values we should be having in mind as we approach these conversations, the more that our judgment can really be bolstered by those values and hopefully end up in
Right.
the right place. And I find that, they love to say in school that there's no such thing as a stupid question. But I think that as adults also, we sometimes get out of the habit of asking questions and asking for help. And sometimes it's a really good reminder that even when we're grown-ups, we can still reach out for help. And that if a situation is complex enough that we're sitting in bed at night, not able to sleep because we're running through it, that might be a signal that this is a good moment to get some outside support, some other, brains in the room, and that there are people that can do that and keep it discreet and really help us navigate the next steps.
Right.
And
Right.
I find that the more we're personally involved, in some ways, the harder it is to see a situation objectively and the more helpful it can be to get that outside viewpoint,
Right. Yes.
and really help balance that.
Right. Judgment, the good judgment that that comes from the from uh, from seeking out someone else's opinion in regard to it. Yes.
Absolutely. And it can help us realize where we have a blind spot, or maybe a certain thing drives us crazy, but objectively isn't necessarily as big of an issue as we might think. So
Right.
that sense of balance. And I would say before we get into the more nitty-gritty details, who are the parties, who are the people that have obligations in this scenario? The dating people, the friends, the parents, who is kind of the cast of characters that we're working with?
Right. So, first of all, the parties themselves, the two sides, you have the young man, the young woman that are going out, and their families. Very often, the families are involved. So they have a set of obligations in terms of divulging information at times when it's appropriate. Though we'll get to the details later. And then, in addition to that, you have the person who serves as a reference, either the person who's literally on what they call nowadays the resume, or someone else who is sought out. And that person also, there's a set of guidelines how that person should respond to a request for information or to specific questions. Um, and then, of course, you also have, by way of example, the shadchan, who has, has a particular status, let's call it, in that if someone is suggesting this and to both sides, then that shadchan also has a set of responsibilities.
Absolutely. And how does it play in as well when you're not necessarily an official reference, but you're getting a call or you're getting the casual outreach? What do you know? Oh, you're from this area. What do you know about, so and so person?
So actually, there shouldn't be a fundamental difference. There might be slightly shades of difference, but fundamentally, in terms of the guidelines, whether the person is on the resume in an official capacity, or the individual is someone who wasn't on the resume and they track down someone or they have, really it's the same. The person has to balance on the one hand, as you noted before, avoiding Lashon Hara when that is the most important factor. And on the other hand, the individual sometimes might be obligated to provide some information when that is called for, depending upon what the halacha is, depending on obviously what the situation is. So you can't have, let's say, for example, someone who says, I'll be on the resume and will only, and then we'll follow like a very narrow kind of path. And then, that 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 may not be possible. An individual, even if they're on the resume, even if they've been asked to in what I would call advocate, and they may try to present things in a very positive kind of way. It doesn't absolve them of all the responsibilities that we have in the halacha, again, to on the one hand avoid Lashon Hara, but on the other hand to also protect both parties.
Absolutely. And so let's start talking about the parties and say the parties have some element of their history that's complicated. There's something in their own background. How how do we think about guidelines in terms of when to disclose things about ourselves and when not to, and how that works in terms of the process?
Right. So obviously, first of all, some of this is expected. It should be noted that every party going into Shidduchim and their family and the individual's family will be interested, they have a vested interest in trying to make sure to present themselves in the best way possible. And if there is some issue that exists, then they have an understandable motivation to try to avoid harm to their reputation, their ability to be able to find the shidduch. Um, they may be concerned that if someone finds that information without getting a chance to know them, then in that case, they won't be looked at. The very important factor that they won't be looked at as a whole person, but person that will sometimes be exaggerated or will stand out in when you have some kind of issue which is viewed in isolation before they get a chance to even meet one another. So the obligation that they sometimes will have um, to divulge information is based upon really it's a din min Torah, and it's generally called, we generally refer to as Geneves Das, or oh no, you're not allowed to deceive someone else when you're in a transaction. And in the end, going out and getting married is the transaction. Two people are agreeing to something. They're going to get married to one another, and you're not allowed to deceive someone in that context. And therefore, if there's a really significant issue, we're going to talk at some point in time about the kinds of issues and the level of severity. But if they're really significant issue, the poskim basically agree that you cannot, that the two parties can't hide that from one another. Whether they have to reveal it immediately or whether they might have some flexibility to reveal a little bit later on, but they cannot conceal a severe issue. That would be an Isser of Onoah, or what we call Geneves Das. And in addition to that, one critical element in regard to this, which it's mentioned in the post game, in addition to the fact that this is something which makes a lot of sense because we know, the foundations of a good marriage. So even in the contemporary leading post game, they will mention that if a side conceals information from the other side and they move ahead with an engagement in a marriage, and then only find out about it afterwards, that can seriously affect the degree of trust in the marriage. And that's a foundation, because they sometimes will wonder, well, wait a second, when some issue will come up, they'll have a sense of resentment, like you didn't tell me about that. I didn't sign up for this, and sometimes they'll think to themselves, there's something else which you're not telling me, or is this part of, a pattern that I'm not, that transparency is not a value or is not essential within the context of our marriage. So that is, in a sense, as important. I'm not as important because we understand how important marriage is from a Torah perspective, and a good marriage from a Torah perspective, and Shalom Bayis from a Torah perspective. That the poskim say is a critical additional element, even if we would have a scenario in which we would be able to argue that they don't have to reveal the information. So if it's the kind of information that could potentially cause that kind of resentment, might erode trust in some way, then without a doubt it should be revealed at the right time.
I think that's such a powerful message because there's a very real impulse to want your loved one to be seen as a whole person, and that if this information is out there, they're not going to get a fair chance, or maybe they're not going to get set up with really great people. And what I've seen, having worked more on the divorce side of the spectrum, I've seen multiple situations where there was this kind of deception. And the problem is there's no good time to say, by the way, there's a big secret here. The day after the wedding is not a better time. The day after Sheva Brachos is not a better time. 5 years in is not a better time. And so it can just keep going and keep going until it comes out, at which point in every case where I've seen this, the loss of trust is what then damaged the relationship really irreparably, where it wasn't even the issue. Often many issues, medicine has a long ways to go, but a lot has advanced, and there are many, many situations that can be really improved with, different treatments. But trust, when it's been fundamentally broken, is very, very hard to put back together. And I think that sometimes there is a short-term view. Let's just get these people and get everyone to the chuppah, but then we don't always think about what's going to happen the day after that and the day after that. And are we setting everyone up for a really long-term, healthy, happy relationship?
Right. You don't want chas v'shalom somebody to feel like they were manipulated. You don't want somebody to feel like they were, trapped in any which way. That's the worst kind of feeling. But that, a normal human being, when there's a stress within the marriage, and especially if it relates to that particular issue, a normal person could feel that way. And that obviously, as you're saying, can be very damaging.
Absolutely. And that actually brings me to the next question, which is everyone has their pet peeves, their deal breakers. I'm sure anyone listening who's involved in Shidduchim has heard very creative, deal breakers. And so, how do you separate the thing that has to be talked about? How do we define what's kind of at the level of intensity or severity where this really has to be shared versus something that maybe feels like it's not as big of a deal? And especially if you're normalized to something, it might not feel like as big a deal. Although, if you're inclined to keep it a secret, that in itself might say something about the severity level of the information. But how do we separate what's a big deal and what's not such a big deal in terms of how we think about disclosure?
Right. That is a very complicated topic. As one might expect in the post game, there's a lot of different specific questions, and this is what they will constantly discuss. Is this considered to be, a really severe kind of issue, or maybe it's not so severe? So it's not easy to answer. I'll just, in general terms, um, there are different kinds of issues that require different rules around disclosure. Let's say in a case of what we call different sources use different language. In the case of what you call a severe issue, that is, severe issue means something which is likely to disrupt the marriage, and an issue that generally we would assume that many people in the society and the culture that one is in, the community that one is in, one would not want to necessarily move ahead with the shidduch. That's considered a severe issue. And then that kind of concern has to be brought to the front and has to be divulged early on. One is not allowed to move forward in regard to a shidduch without sharing that kind of information. One critical point I'll mention already at the beginning is that it can depend upon the community and the society's expectations, um, and it also can depend upon the individual's expectations. So if a particular family really, if they're just posturing, it's one thing. But if they really have something that they really are concerned about, and for them it's important, and let's say whatever it might be, it can be a health issue, it can be an issue of character, personality. If that's something which is important to them, then that is an issue which has to be dealt with that level of seriousness, and then it has to be divulged up front, usually even before the first date. Um, then there are other kinds of issues. I'm going to use different terminology. There's significant issues, which could not the same level of likelihood that it would disrupt the marriage. Maybe it would work out. We're not sure, but we have real doubts in regard to it. That also has to be divulged at some point in time. That's where what we'll find in post-game is, and guidance from Rabbanim, that sometimes they will say, oh, this issue, you have to raise it around the third or fourth date. And again, that can vary based upon a lot of different, based upon the circumstances, the culture, based upon the dynamics between the people. But then that's an issue which also has to be divulged. And again, that can be based upon societal expectations or the needs of the individual in the family. Let's say a person has, again, one individual going out is very sensitive to something, so then that then becomes a serious issue for them. And then you have mild issues. Mild issues are issues which, probably should be presented, or it's oftentimes, and I'm not talking about inconsequential issues, but mild issues that have to do with maybe a slight health issue, maybe a slight mental health issue, things along those lines should be divulged, but there's a little bit more flexibility. And that's where, guidance in terms of when to raise it and how it should be raised, that's something which is absolutely critical. I should make an editorial or maybe a general comment in regard to this, that in the Chofetz Chaim Sefer, he discusses this whole topic about when you have to divulge information, and he refers to the circumstance in which you are absolutely compelled to divulge the information. He refers to it as chesronos atzumim, very significant or powerful kinds of shortcomings. And then he just mentions a couple of different things. He mentions like serious health issues, and he mentions heresy, what we call apikorsis. What's pointed out is that as society has changed and expectations in regard to marriage have changed, that's just what I referred to before. It's a mitzias, it's a reality. So consequently, the kinds of issues that have to be raised have increased, have broadened enormously. Now people are interested in sometimes issues relating to personality and issues relating to mental health, which really weren't discussed by the Chofetz Chaim at all. But those will depend upon, again, societal expectations, and will depend upon the particular needs of that individual or sometimes the family as well. So we have to address those issues depending upon the severity, let's call it. And sometimes the issue would have to be brought up initially, right at the beginning. Sometimes it can wait a little bit. Sometimes, again, you have a little bit more flexibility when it's a mild issue.
That's really helpful. And I was thinking as you were speaking about that element of changing over time, that depending on what exactly we're looking for or expecting out of marriage, that can really change what's a big deal and a medium deal, and how that, and also just social norms of what's feels really problematic behavior can also shift over time. And so it's very interesting how it's sort of living in the world and evolving as it goes, as opposed to
Yeah.
a set it and forget it.
They quoted, Rav Zilberstein said, the rabbis don't decide what's considered a big issue in regard to Shidduchim. He said, he actually was quoted as having said, the rabbis don't decide, it's society, the tzibur decides. So that really, captures this particular point.
Absolutely. And we actually have a question that I think really speaks to this, that if we can extend this thread a little longer, the question, and we might come back to part of it, but how do we handle questions and information that's not necessarily about the person themselves, but really about their family? So someone wants to know what's the dynamic in the home, and you happen to know that it's not a good dynamic, but that's not public. Or if there's, say, a sibling who's gotten divorced and there's questions about, well, what happened and who was at fault? How do we handle information that's sort of 1 degree removed? It's not the individual themselves, but it can potentially inform how they see the world and how they might operate in a relationship. And of
Right.
course, that can also get pushed to the extreme in an unhealthy way. But
Right.
how do we think
Right.
about the rest of the family and when it comes to these types of inquiries?
Right. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's not going to be a black and white answer in regard to this. And that would depend upon, first of all, the significance of the issue. And also, if one is able to, if it's someone who I know who's asking me that question, and I have a sense as to what that person really cares about, um, what those person's needs are, then I can answer more accurately. And sometimes it might compel me to, let's say, for example, divulge more information. Let's say I know that that person is very sensitive And I know this family, there are a lot of the conversations and interactions are abrasive. So I'll give an example. So that can be very significant, even though it doesn't have to do with the parties themselves, the two individuals. Um, so each case is going to be a little bit different, and again, what you'll find is these kinds of things discussed in the poskim, but you won't be able to quote it like Rav Sternbach said the following or Zilberstein said the following. You have to apply it in each case. So they talk about what happens if there's an issue amongst siblings, issues among siblings. So then, okay, at one point in time, maybe it could be that that's relatively mild. We might say that based upon society, that within the context of a family, that there are certain issues that will come up. And then we might view that as, a mild kind of issue, bring that up later, bring it up, before they get engaged or something along those lines. That's where good judgment and applying good judgment together with the values and the guidelines is important. But there might be a circumstance in which, again, where if there's, let's say, for example, chas v'shalom, chaos in the home, there's a serious conflict in the home. Let's say, for example, there's an impending divorce of the parents or something along those lines. So then that becomes a lot more serious. And then you have to then figure out what kind of issue is it and how could it potentially affect the marriage? Then you have to, if in fact, let's say, we'd say that this is something which is important. I know this family, and this family, they say that one thing which is really important for their child in terms of her personality, and she really wants a warm and affectionate and home, and that's something which she's always thought about and always valued, etc., then that means that presenting this kind of information about the family, which would be to the country, then it becomes a lot more compelling. I have to present it and present it early, maybe before they start going out. That will be a judgment call, depending upon a lot of variables. So each case is going to be different. Sometimes you'll have a situation where, again, there's some issue, like you're saying, one step removed, or the sibling, family, something or another is going on. You can't give a general rule and say, well, because it doesn't apply to the two individuals, so therefore, therefore we say that you're not supposed to divulge that information, lol, and you can simply conceal it. That certainly is not true. The timing of when it should be divulged would depend upon those variables, judging how important an issue it is.
Absolutely. As you were sharing the example of the theoretical sensitive person with this very abrasive family, what I kept thinking is that would make for some very long 3-day yontifs if you were over visiting, but that sort of thing can really generate stress. And what I find interesting about all this is that in some ways, we can have in our mind that sharing information equals end of the shidduch and it's all our fault in a way that can feel like a lot of pressure. But I feel like there also could be a possibility that depending on the information, but that sharing information could allow someone to proceed, but to do so with an open mind, knowing that yes, this part of it is going to be hard, or yes, we're going to have to do some research, or this piece is going to be more complicated, but that depending on what it is, there can still be space potentially for a relationship to move forward. But the person knows kind of what they're walking into and is making that decision with, an informed, mindset, and going into a situation where this piece of it is going to be challenging, or this element is going to be a tough dynamic, but I'm choosing this anyway because there are so many great qualities that this person has, can also make for a healthier mindset as you're in the relationship and dealing with different struggles.
Right. That's a very important point. There are some will emphasize that point very strongly, that in general, even though obviously each circumstance, every situation has to be dealt with on its own, there's no uniform rule, but as a value, we want two people to go out with one another and be able to view get a sense to appreciate the other person and then to view the person as a whole. Now, that doesn't mean that as a consequence, you can then say, well, in regard to every single issue, you can push it off until the fourth or the sixth date or something like that. That's just not true. But at the same time, that as a general rule is something which is important, because we recognize That's the way human relationships work. If two people connect with one another, it doesn't mean that the other person is perfect. If they begin to, they begin to feel a sense of connection and affection with the other person, the other person is not perfect. And to the extent that you allow for that to happen, again, it's not an absolute uniform black and white rule, but the extent that you can allow for that to happen, that is a value that's important. So there's a push towards that when the halacha will allow for it, when that's something which we think may be helpful to both sides, when it's something which really seems to be justified and called for, in a given situation, we'll say, you know what, let's give it some time. Maybe we'll give a date. We'll give it 2, 3, 4, right? There's a serious issue. Let them meet first because we really think maybe that they'll hit it off, or maybe two individuals who have struggled in terms of their ability to meet the right person, and we really think this is going to work. Now there's a serious issue, but so that's where we would the variables will change from one situation to another.
Absolutely. And it comes to mind, I was reading Bina magazine probably years ago, and there was a letter to the editor where this woman was talking about how it was very important to her when she made her Shidduchim that her kids only married people in town. So presumably in the New York area somewhere, right? And
Brooklyn.
then here she goes. She marries her daughter to, a nice young man from in town, and they move out of town. And she had this feeling of like, this isn't what I signed up for. And so I feel like there is this element where no matter what we know or don't know, there's still people, there's going to be issues to work out. Life is going to happen. Life usually goes not exactly the way we expect. And so that element of separating kind of the knowledge, what are sort of the things we need to make sure that these are two basically healthy people that are set up to do well together versus almost an over engineering of the relationship that we're plotting out exactly, they're going to live here and they're going to name their kids this when really they're going to live their lives. And of course, unexpected things are going to be part of that. So that sort of balance of setting everyone up for success while also recognizing that as humans, we don't get to control all the things that come next that are part of that relationship.
Right. And those things that sometimes we think are, oh, it has to be this way because we have this very distinct image in our mind. Well, not exactly that way. Not exactly.
I will say, as a non-New Yorker, there's a lot of good things out of town too. So,
Right. Right.
depending on what it is. But it was also an interesting example of just how everyone has their own things that are absolutely critical for them and separating out what's important to that person versus what's important in general,
Right.
thinking that through. And that actually brings me to my next question, which is really about timing. And I know we talked about how timing can really shift. But what are some of the basic principles in terms of when to share what? And it definitely, again, as you mentioned, connects to severity and to other pieces. But what's sort of the general framework of what we share when?
Okay. So again, in regard to a issue which is really severe, then the information should be shared oftentimes before they go out. Sometimes in extreme circumstances, poskim are quoted as having given a special dispensation, which would have to be given on a case by case basis, that maybe they can go at one time. And then afterwards, the information will be divulged. There are many circumstances where it's not that severe, but at the same time, as I said, significant issues in which either from a societal perspective, many people in society would say, I'm not moving forward in regard to this. Or again, it may be that these individuals have a sensitivity around it. Many times, there are issues that should be divulged, and we usually try to what's evolved. The Chofetz Chaim doesn't talk about this directly, but the later poskim have, and they usually assume that let the couple go out a few times. What they want to try to get is to a point where they appreciate one another. So going out once usually is not enough. Twice is oftentimes not enough. They talk about 3, 4 times. That way they have a sense to appreciate one another. They have a sense of the qualities of the other person, the character of the other person. And then at the same time, in this is, wouldn't be true in the Hasidic community. It wouldn't be possible to go 3, 4 times necessarily because they get engaged very quickly. But most of the time, that juncture, we would assume that there wouldn't be some kind of emotional connection, an investment, a sense of attachment, so it'd be difficult if at that point, if something was divulged, they reconvene, they discuss it. Are we willing to move forward? And if they decide not to move forward, that it will be something which will be devastating. So that we try to get to that kind of middle ground, and that can vary. And there are circumstances in which maybe for whatever reason, given the personalities of the two people, again, because of all kinds of different variables, maybe they've gone out 6 times, and then they're moving very slowly. Maybe the dates have been very short or something along those lines. So then maybe we would say that the 4 is not written in stone. And sometimes if the issue is a milder issue, or again, the importance of trust, sometimes there may be halachic reasons why one would divulge even a milder issue. So then sometimes it can be a little bit later. You will find sometimes, a reference to bringing up an issue before them getting engaged. So again, that sometimes can happen as well. So usually, again, it's good to consult, good to get some guidance in terms of what's appropriate in a particular situation. And when it's a significant issue and we're not sure what's going to happen, then, let's say it's not severe, but significant, we want to be able to allow them to get a chance to know one another, but at the same time, be able to, if necessary, end the relationship without there being too much of a toll.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of nuance to that in a way, that it is true that for certain things, and with the very severe, putting those aside, for certain things, this person won't have a chance to build a relationship if it's right off the bat. But that once you know someone and you've built a real connection with someone, the other person is able to make a more informed decision about how much they think they can handle that particular challenge, and whether they're able to move forward. That it doesn't have to be all or nothing. That you say it right off the bat, or it comes up 10 years after the wedding. That there is this room in between that really helps take into account all of the different considerations. Because I always feel like if there's too much incentive not to do something, it's very hard to get people to do it. And for that information to come out and that couple to go in knowing that there's going to be this challenge, but we're committed to working together to figure it out, and we'll get the support we need, that sets everyone up for
Right,
success.
right. It's a completely different picture when they get a chance to know one another, and then the way that they look at the issue can be. There are many marriages that happen in this way. Then they say, this issue, well, if you had asked me in the abstract, I would say, no, why would I want to get involved in, with this particular? But at the same time, I'm really impressed and really taken by this person, and I really value and appreciate and all these various different qualities. And then now I'm envisioning how I would deal with this issue, and and how we would deal with this issue. Not only I would deal with it, we would deal with it together. Then they made there are many marriages where in which the individual decides I'm ready to move forward in regard to this, and then again it's with that trust that this was shared with me, and I am fully aware of oftentimes in these circumstances they will say, you don't only have to trust me depending upon the particular issue, you don't have to rely upon me. Here you can speak to my Rabbi, the rabbi of the shul. You can speak to maybe it's a professional who knows about this issue, and that transparency can be essential, critical for, again, both parties feeling that they're moving forward, having, if anything, it can sometimes strengthen the relationship because, we trust one another. I can trust you with private information, and you can be supportive, and you decided that you're accepting me. So that in and of itself can be very powerful as well if the couple decides to move forward.
Absolutely. And there's something powerful about someone knowing that this is an issue that I struggle with, and this is how I handle it. And I can see that really actually, in some ways, taking that couple to maybe a deeper level of emotional intimacy and connection than all couples have at that stage.
Right.
And so, up until now, we've been talking a lot about the couple and what to share with each other. And I want to shift now to the third party scenario. Now, I have a personal Murphy's Law, which is that if I get a Shidduch reference call, it's always at a terrible time when I pick up the phone thinking it's the school or the doctor or something I'm waiting for. And here you are, and you have to decide what to do. And in an ideal world, this only happens when you only have glowing things to say about the person and, their family and their pet cat. But in a situation where there is something uncomfortable, what are kind of some of the foundations for how we think about sharing information when we're that third party, we're getting that call?
Right, right. So first of all, in a sense, before getting to the particulars, there are halachos that the Chavetz Chaim presents that relate to, and this is what we call when I do have to divulge information. I can get to like some of the categories and some of the situations in which it may be called for. But when I have to divulge information, there are a number of rules that I have to keep in mind. It's really something that a person should know pretty much. It should be at their fingertips. So first of all, you have to know the information. You can't just sharing information like conjecture. I once heard, I thought, this, that. It's important to share information that you're confident in. Sometimes I haven't heard the information myself. I heard it, maybe by accident or whatever it was, but from somebody else. I have circumstantial evidence. I have a responsibility to offer information to someone if there's any element of what we call a shortcoming or something which appears negative. I have to be confident in that information. I'm not allowed to exaggerate it at all. One way of it's presented, I think, which is helpful, is let's imagine that I was talking about my favorite cousin and I had to divulge this information. How would I say it? I have to be accurate, but I want to say it so I'm not going to exaggerate at all, not one iota. So here as well, I can't exaggerate. I have to have intention that I'm doing it for this person's benefit and not because I harbor any grudge or ill will towards the person I'm talking about. That's a very serious problem. Sometimes, let's say in the case of a broken engagement, or let's say, for example, if there was a divorce, and then you say, let's ask the other party. And that is not a simple, somebody needs there is a circumstance which you definitely need rabbinic guidance because it's pointed out that it's almost impossible for someone to be able to then speak without any element of some, call it natural human, kind of negativity towards that person. And that actually is a very, very serious problem. There are ways to navigate it, but it's not always simple. And also, you can't say any more than what's necessary. In other words, let's say, for example, I'm asked that question about the individual. And let's assume for a minute, I really think it's a bad idea. So I'll just go over this for a second, just a scenario. I really think it's a bad idea. Now, this person who's calling me up knows me, and they trust me a lot. They trust me somewhat. So I should say as little as possible in order to get them not to go out, or as little as possible in order to. So what does that mean? I might say, I don't know if it's a good idea, or I don't think you should go out. And then if there are three issues that I might know about, I would only say what's necessary. If one would deter them from going out. So when I'm asked questions, again, I'm sharing as little negative information as possible under the circumstances. And I also have to try to make sure, this is also an important point, that when I share this information, let's say you get a call from somebody, you don't know the individual before, and then you have to say something. Let's assume for a minute, maybe you have to say something. You have to say, I want to make sure that you're not going to share this information with other people. Because if I'm telling you this information, that's Toelis, because you need to know, because you're going out, or it's your son or your daughter who's going out. But you providing that information to anyone else, right? Talking to friends and family and telling them, we just the following person, we found that we're not going out because of the following. That's unnecessary. I am responsible for actually emphasizing that information cannot be shared with other people in order to protect the person who we're speaking about. So all of those things are critical. There are some other things as well, but those are some of the things that a person should keep in mind. Those are all mentioned essentially by the Chavetz Chaim. One of the other things which to keep in mind is when if I say something which is I call a shortcoming, it's negative, it's not, person doesn't have the particular quality. I certainly when I'm asked information can try to present things as you said before in a very positive way. Let's say they ask about a particular I don't know person's capabilities in some area, and maybe that's not their strongest their strongest trait. Um, and then I can then say at the same time, you're talking about a person who has, and I can talk about the person's qualities. And that's something which oftentimes, let's say, I want to advocate for the person, and I then can tell the truth, but at the same time, I'm able to put it in context and talk about qualities that then gives you a fuller picture. That's something which is important. One other critical point in regard to this is also to try to get a sense as to what this person is asking, or what this person needs. That's sometimes difficult to do. If I know the individual, then I know what they're asking, or I can have a better sense as to what their expectations and needs are. But if I get a call from somebody, I don't know this is I'm Mr. So and so, Mrs. So and I want to know as to whether this person is, let's take a word, responsible. Responsible? Like responsible is so responsibility in lots of things to lots of different people, right? And depending, so if I know a little bit better, and sometimes I might ask, depending upon, I might ask that question. What do you mean? Could you tell me a little about yourselves, what your daughter or what your son needs? Things along those lines. Um, but I'll say sometimes, I might think to myself, well, I don't think that they're so responsible, but maybe because I'm not talking about myself, but maybe it's because I'm a super responsible person. I'm one of these people that I super responsible. I'm not allowed to give, and I don't think the person's, I can't say that because in a circumstance where there's an element of judgment, I have to be careful. So knowing what that person is asking, it's it should be in accordance with the needs and the expectations of the person asking. And so that's sometimes a real challenge when you don't know what those needs and expectations are. So then generally one will try to answer in a more favorable kind of way. Not saying anything which is untrue, but on the other hand, you know, certainly not jumping to a conclusion like, I don't know, if you have a Rosh Hashiva who's asked a question, there's Rosh Hashiva is a Gadol B'Torah, right? He should not be asking questions as to whether this boy is a serious Ben Torah based upon his own standard, right? Or, you know,
Right.
uh, right? You have to do it based upon. So that's something which can be challenging at times if you don't know the other the other people.
I will say I was on a shidduch call once and I someone asked me a question and I said, well, I think X, etc. And then there was a silence, and I said, "Well, let's back up. What do you mean by that?" And they had a different meaning than I did, and
Right,
and then I was able to explain it, but it was the pause that clued me in. And I'm
right,
curious, and this is the question that we got, so I'll partly ask it from the chat, but maybe with a twist. So say there's a scenario, right? Your roommate from yeshiva, we can call him Joe, had a horrible temper. You were afraid to sleep in the dorm at night with him because his temper was so legendary and felt so threatening, and now you're getting a shit up call. That's the type of situation where, say, it runs potentially more severe, that this person really might not be so healthy. Is that the sort of thing? How much do you share? Do you have to be directly asked, hi, does Joe have a temper? Or is that something that if someone clearly is asking about Joe, they're trying to get a sense of what he's like, what his personality is, that you would be obligated to put out there to make sure that the person knows or looks into, or with the caveat of, it's been 2 years since we dormed together and he might have grown in this area, but this is what was going on. So I'm curious, I mean, just thinking of the kinds of examples that I've heard, in specific scenarios where people will say after the fact that they noticed it, how do we think about sharing information when it does potentially speak to something more severe versus I prefer this character trait, which maybe they have or don't have, but where we
right,
are worried that there's a possibility that this is really not a healthy person and that this could be a huge disaster if it goes forward. And
right,
what's our role in that?
right. So in a circumstance in which I have a strong sense, and again, I have to make sure that it's not just my judgment, but others, let's say, for example, would feel the same way. Maybe I've talked it over with others. I have a confidence in regard to this. That, let's say, for example, this person has, let's say, a temper and anger that would really jeopardize a relationship, um, and similar kinds of issues. Then actually there's it's based upon lo samar adam reacho, which sounds pretty strong. But that's what the poskim quote, lo samar adam reacho, is I am not allowed to stand by as a fellow Jew is being harmed. That actually would mean, many say, that I would be obligated to divulge such information even if I was not asked.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I'm a third party and I wasn't asked, and I find out that the two, and I think that an individual, the other party doesn't know about this particular problem, because the anger will only manifest in certain circumstances, but they would do a good job at concealing it otherwise. I'm just pointing out the extreme cases. I'm not saying is where it has to be assessed. You could have extreme cases where any person would be obligated. Now, then you might say, well, what is it? That's where you have to figure out. And then person will say, but what about Lashon Hara? What about the other individual's welfare? So then this is where, when you have conflicting halachic values, you have to figure out which one takes precedence. And Lo Samar Adam Reacha would most definitely take precedence when it's applicable. When you don't have Lo Samar Adam Reacha, you still have, when a person is asking you a question, this is what, again, I'll use what some of the poskim will emphasize. You have V'haftal kamocha. That's a pretty well-known obligation. V'haftal kamocha is not something abstract. In halacha, that means that you act in the interest. You want to do what's good to help someone else. When I'm being asked a question, then there's a very strong argument that's given that in that circumstance, I then have an obligation of V'haftal kamocha. It's come to me, someone's come to me, and I have an obligation to do what I would want done to me, in the circumstance. And then again, I may have some kind of obligation to share information. You know, I might say I don't know where the person's at the present time. I might have to figure out how to present it, how to say it. The poskim will say, and this is where judgment comes in, and that's different. You might say something which is not necessarily like, you say it like outright and in a explicit kind of way, but you say it in a more guarded or couched kind of way in which any discerning person will understand what you're saying. So that's where, you have to figure out, depending on the circumstances, what it is that you're going to share. Um, and and so there are sometimes these kinds of obligations if I'm asked for advice, and this is where things can shift. If I'm asked, so would you advise me to go out?
Mm-hmm.
That's where there's another obligation that sometimes will come up, which is that you have to give every fellow Jew a tova when you're asked for it. Um, Again, sometimes maybe it depends upon the severity, but maybe you can avoid giving it. You can tell them to ask somebody else, maybe. But sometimes it seems many assume that when you're being asked for good advice, you're supposed to give good advice. It's based upon lifnei. You take a look Rashi on lifnei lo sitein michshol. Lo sitein michshol. Rashi says that you have to give eitzah hogenes. You have to give proper advice. And here somebody's asked me advice. That's in regard to any Jew who asked me for proper advice. That also could be a compelling reason why I would have to, give an answer. Again, sometimes I might decide it's not one size catch up. I might decide to say it directly. I might decide to couch it in a certain way, but all these obligations do apply in these circumstances when you're very seriously concerned about the individual. And again, you can sometimes say, look, I haven't seen the person in a couple of years, so I don't know this to be true, but, you know, sometimes, but certainly a person in that circumstance, people make a mistake that when they're confronted with, I just won't say anything at all, or I'll skirt the issue, or I'm not sure. It's not so simple. It's not so simple at all. I just want to note that there's a sefer, they quote a sefer called Pisrei Tshuva, written in the 1800s in Vilna. And in this sefer, the Pisrei Tshuva, he says that a lot of people are very concerned about Lashon Hara when it comes to Shidduchim. He says, I have a bigger concern. I'm concerned about the times that people are supposed to provide information and they don't. He actually says so again, that's not to make it black and white, because it really depends upon the severity of the issue and a lot of other factors. But it does mean that every individual has a responsibility to protect someone. I don't know this person who's calling me up, but I have an obligation to that person right now. After Recha Kamocha applies to every Jew, even the person on the phone who I may never meet in person. Yeah,
It's very powerful. And I've worked with a number of people who have been in really, really bad situations. And what has happened, and I've heard this many times, not even once or twice, that after the marriage ends, they'll get a lot of like, oh, I knew, I saw this person had these issues for many years. Sometimes it's not public, but I've seen many, many situations actually where a lot of people will come out at the end and say that they knew these things, and the person would tell me, why didn't anyone give me this information before? And I think that element of
yeah,
it's easier not to be involved because it is a lot of work. I think, and what we can't promise you is that this is quick and easy. This is work, this is
right,
time, this is getting advice, this is understanding the halachos, being really thoughtful about what you say and how you say it. So this is a lot more work than just missing the call and pretending it never happened. But that element of there's real suffering that can be prevented when people who know about pretty complicated
right,
issues speak up, and that we don't have to figure it out by ourselves, that we can get
right,
advice on, is this a really big deal, is this not a big deal, what do I share, when do I share it, how do I share it, that we don't have to
right,
navigate that alone, but that the costs of not sharing can sometimes in these really bad situations be so high, where of course we don't want to say Lashon Hara, but that we have to really see them both as potentially very dangerous things, and then use halachic guidance and that element of seichel, of judgment, and common sense to figure out
right,
what's the way forward that's the best balance between all the
right.
things we're worried about.
Right. It's really important to note, sometimes again, instead of repeating what I said before, people can think that I'm not actually, causing the person to trip. I'm not putting a stumbling block in front of the person. I didn't say they should go out, so it's not my responsibility. In those extreme circumstances where you know that the individual unfortunately has like, let's call it characterological, like issues, like real serious kinds of issues, that will very likely affect the marriage and the relationship in a very severe kind of way, um, then it's important to know that the Torah doesn't allow us to simply stand aside and watch another harm come to another Jew. That's simply Lo Samar Adam Reacha says exactly that. I didn't do anything. I just was passive. Well, that's not okay. In fact, Reb Chaim Volozhin has this is really a very powerful point, because Reb Chaim Volozhin says the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim says Lo salech rechil ba'amecha, and then it says Lo samar adam riyacha immediately afterwards. It says, what's the juxtaposition between the two of them? One is saying not to speak what we call Lashon Hara, and then it says Lo samar adam riyacha. He says it's there, it expresses exactly this point. Lo salech rechil ba'amecha, but sometimes Lo samar adam riyacha. That sometimes, and that becomes the priority, and that becomes the obligation. Lo samar adam riyacha. You can't. So he says that's the reason why both are in the same pasuk, because on the surface they don't seem to be connected to one another. That's a very powerful point. A person can't say, I'm careful about lashon hara. So he was saying, person, I'm machmir regarding to lashon hara, so therefore I can't say anything because I go to an extreme in regard to it. You can't be machmir in regard to lashon hara and then transgress something which is worse than which the halacha would require you to act upon.
Absolutely. And it reminds me as well of some of the literature out there about bystander effects and the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
bystander role, that there's a real issue, and it's documented that when many, many people see something, it's like, oh, he's gonna call
Let
911.
somebody else do it.
Oh, they're gonna go jump in the water. Like
Why would I be
there's
the one?
right. And apparently I happen to really enjoy working in Starbucks on Fridays, so I think of this one, but there are studies that show that if you ask a specific person, can you keep an eye on my laptop? they're actually much more likely to intervene if someone does try and steal your laptop, where if you just leave it to the universe, that's not going to work so well.
Right.
And so it's this interesting element where it can be easy to feel that, oh, someone else is going to tell them. They're making their calls. They're going to get the information they need. I don't have to get involved. But really, what Lo Tamid Al Dam Riacha, I think, in many ways pushes against is that bystander mentality that you have a responsibility. Yes, maybe there's 50 other people on this beach or watching this situation, but you personally have an obligation. And all of us have to worry about our own obligations, regardless of who else is going to say something or not say something. We have this really personal thing that we have this really personal element where this is our opportunity to help someone and to prevent harm from happening on our watch. And it's on our watch whether or not the call is directly coming to us. And I think
Right, 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 right. It's extremely important, and because of the fact we live in a broader society in which that we see that happens, that sense like somebody else will take care of this, and why would I be the hero? It's important to note that that's not consistent with the Torah's perspective, and it's very important to note that a person again sometimes might say, "So why am I going to do this?" And I don't see anybody else doing it. If nobody else is doing it, so maybe it's okay to call the person who you call to ask a shaila. Is it okay for me not to say anything? That's where don't hesitate. Pick up the phone. Say, is it okay? And the person might say, other people, this is common. This is well known. This is unfortunately, as the Pischei Tshuva wrote in the 1800s, the famous story with Rav Shlomo Kluger. He actually wrote this himself. Rav Shlomo Kluger, one of the Gedolim from the 18th century. Rav Shlomo Kluger, in the introduction to one of his Svarim, wrote about a terrible circumstance in which his granddaughter, who he loved dearly, was set up with someone, and he really harshly criticized in the beginning of a sefer that he was not told by people who he trusted, he was not told about the individual and his family. And I don't repeat the words that he used in regard to this. As a consequence, he records this. He talks about his granddaughter ultimately, unfortunately, passed away. It's very unsettling. But this, in other words, this is something which happens that somehow, you can trace this. What were those people thinking? Exactly what you're describing. Like, what, we're going to badmouth these people? Maybe it's Lashon Hara. Maybe somebody else would do it, etc. Then nobody did it. And this was the result. And it's not okay. It's not okay. And every individual on some level bears responsibility then in regard to it. You can't say, well, it's collectively everybody didn't do it, so then nobody's responsible. Actually, the opposite is true. Unfortunately, everybody was responsible to have done something, Yeah.
very powerful. And I'm not a Rev, but I would suspect that there are more am I allowed to say questions than am I allowed not to say. So I think that's a really good takeaway for all of us, that we might not actually be operating halachically and responsibly by keeping our mouths shut, depending on what we know and how severe it is. And so we're always very careful not to say something we shouldn't say, which is a very good mindset in general, but that there really is this counterbalance.
Yeah.
And I'd love to ask one more general question, and then we do have some great questions in the Q&A, so we'll go to those. What's the role of the shadchan in all this? We've been talking about the couple, the references, the parents. What baseline responsibilities does a shadchan have when it comes to disclosing information that might be dangerous, that might be important?
Okay. I'm hoping I'm not unsettling any of the shadchanim out there, but the shadchan actually bears a lot of responsibility in making sure that the two parties know whatever relevant information they should know. Any issue that the two parties would want to know that would be relevant for them, that might concern them, generally assume the shadchan is supposed to share that. Now, shadchan might get a psak, then again, the shadchan speaks to his or her Rav and gets a psak that we can divulge that in the second date, the third date, the fourth date. Okay, but as a general rule, the shadchan bears great responsibility in terms of sharing whatever they know, and that in a sense more than others, because the shadchan is the one who is offering the eitzah. Is where the shadchan is the one who is offering the eitzah, and it has to be eitzah hogenes. So that then comes with a certain level of obligation. When I'm giving advice to someone, I have to give really proper, productive, accurate advice. If I'm giving advice to someone to do something and then concealing something from them, it seems to be a transgression of that principle. And also they're relied upon because the shadchan is the one who's suggesting it, and the shadchan is the one who's facilitating it, and the sense of reliance also seems to increase the halachic responsibility. So you will find amongst the post-game Rav Chaim Kanievsky and others, will emphasize that the shadchan has information that for both parties, that those parties would want to know of whatever type. If it's irrelevant, if it's inconsequential, then it's inconsequential. But if it's consequential, even relatively minor issues, then the shadchan might have an obligation to share all of that. That's important. Shadchan, in a sense, has more responsibility than others. The outside party might not have an obligation to share those more milder kinds of issues, but the shadchan might.
And that's very important, especially if the tactic is, oh, give it a try. How we're sharing information really matters.
Right.
And we're going to aim to conclude by 9:15. So for those of you that are able to stay with us, wonderful. We're just doing the Q&A section at this point, but we have some great questions from the chat. So I'll share some of them and I'd love to get your perspective. The first is if someone asks me so say someone's getting a reference call and they're asked, why did Moshe get divorced? What's the story? And I know his side, but I don't know the ex's side. This is actually very common in any question about any divorce in the history of the world because you get very, very different stories from either side. So, how do you handle sharing information when you know that the information you have essentially is biased because it's one side of a conflict?
It's a very serious problem. As I said before, you have to have, when sharing information, one of the things the Chafetz Chaim said, I think about it, the first thing I said is you have to know. So when you have information which might well be skewed, it comes from a place of bias. So then you have to be very cautious and careful in terms of how it's presented. Now, at the same time, and this is a judgment call, and sometimes you might have to consult with somebody else, how it should be presented. You hear about anger issues, you hear about conflict, you hear about, well, they got divorced, there probably was conflict. Does that mean necessarily, I'm giving an example, if you hear about that broadly, does that necessarily mean that this person is someone who therefore, is going to consistently relate to anyone in that and everyone in that fashion? So that's where a person has to be cautious and careful, delicate, you might say, in terms of how it's presented. Sometimes you're allowed to present secondhand information. If you emphasize it's secondhand information and you emphasize that you don't know it to be true, factually, you heard this. But again, you have to judge it. If, let's say, for example, you only heard it from the divorcee on the other side, right? And then obviously it's going to come with a totally skewed perspective, then it's not so simple. It's not so simple that you'd be able to share that. I'm best friends, let's say, for example, with one side, and then somebody else calls me up and asks about the other side. And so this is where you have to step back and what I call issues of judgment that are not factual, that are based upon, my perspective or somebody else's perspective, really have to be very, very careful and cautious in terms of what you say. That's just a general rule. And then now, if you have confirmation, you believe that you have confirmation, and sometimes you might want to call up again, I keep on saying it's call up the rabbi and says, is this confirmation enough? What do I share? What do I say? Is this enough? I know the following happened, right? What do I say? So then the rabbi says, share this and not that. Share it in the following way. Couch it in a certain way in which you might have to look into this kind of issue or something like that. And that's where again, as I said before, the element of good judgment comes in. And good judgment in this case will determine as to whether person is acting properly from a halachic point of view. What assessing the situation and then assessing what's appropriate, and how to say something in the right way.
Absolutely. And I'll answer or share sort of a portion of the second question, but also how you handle information that was told to you in confidence. I will say one challenge I've had in getting reference calls about friends of mine who have been divorced is also I might know a lot about what went on in that divorce, but it was shared to me in confidence, in the privacy of a conversation and a friendship, and also that sense of how you balance the confidentiality that you have with the subject of the conversation, as well as the responsibility that you owe to the person asking.
Right. So almost always in those circumstances, I would say, even if you think you know what you're doing, call up the rabbi anyways, because this is going to be difficult, this situation. As you said at the beginning, one of the problems in regard to this, sometimes we have our own personal biases. Sometimes we have our own personal, perspectives or sensitivities. And we have to be able to step back from that. Sometimes you want to talk to somebody else to make sure that um, you're not expressing yourself and sharing information from that place, but doing it in the interest of everybody involved and in accordance with what the Allah would want. This is sometimes if a person knows information which was shared in confidence, and let's assume for a minute worst case scenario, you say I think this is gonna be a disaster. Um, there are those who say, there are those who say that you have no choice but to share the information in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't absolve you of lo samod alam riyacha. The fact, there is a halacha that you're supposed to keep things in confidence. That is true. It's to be megala sod. It's called being megala sod. You're not supposed to, if somebody tells you something, as a general rule, you're supposed to keep it in confidence. But lo samod alam riyacha, right? Protecting someone else from what would appear to be expected harm is of greater importance. And if it's not so severe, then that's where you reach out to someone and figure out, so what should I do? What should I do? Because there is a serious issue and the person doesn't know about it. Um, without going into the details of the halacha, it's not so simple. I have an obligation, obviously, to my friend, but this is where, again, from a Torah perspective, that I have an obligation of lo samal damarecha, lo b'afta l'recha kamocha, in regard to any Jew, right? That's a very powerful idea. I may never meet this person. The person is calling me from, I don't know what, from some faraway country, and I don't know who this person is. And I have a full-fledged set of obligations, minat Torah obligations towards this individual. Um, so that's where, we can't just dismiss it and say, well, I have a friend, so therefore I'm gonna ignore my obligations. That's where we're almost always talking it through. I'm pointing out that sometimes a person might have a responsibility to figure out, either I'll say it myself, somebody else will say it, I'll figure out something or another, but I might sometimes have an obligation to say something if it's a more severe kind of issue.
That is it's a very good point that we naturally feel more of a connection with one person, with the person we know than the person we don't know. But it doesn't necessarily follow that we have more of an obligation to this person versus that person.
Right.
That our natural feeling of who I just naturally feel more connected to and more responsible to doesn't always line up.
Right.
And I
There
will
will
say,
be, I will point out just one other thing as well, because there is one
please.
halacha, just once you're bringing that up, there is one halacha that comes up in this context that is not unusual. If if I'm asked information about someone by a relative, and some say the same would apply in regard to someone who's a close acquaintance of mine, then my obligation to share information more readily in regard to even milder issues might there might be a greater obligation for me to share that information. So if my, certainly immediate family member, or maybe it's a cousin, let's say, for example, who calls me up, it's based upon and it's based upon other considerations as well. So there are sometimes differentiations in that particular scenario, in which when I'm asked information by someone who again is either a relative of mine, or I'm asked information by someone who otherwise is very close to me, that I may have a greater obligation to share the information more readily in regard to someone else who ask me the question. Then again, especially it's a milder issue. Do I necessarily have to divulge it? It's not something which is so serious. But that can shift when you have that kind of relationship.
That's really helpful. And we have so many great questions in the chat, but I want to honor our time. We would definitely love to do a part two about this because we've gotten so many thoughtful questions and I feel like there's so much more to say. But I think what I'm taking away here is that what's so hard about this issue, and I think it feels hard for a reason, is that there really is this clash of values, the value of not saying Lashon Hara, the value of protecting our friends and our family and the people that we love, the value of protecting that stranger who might be at risk of getting hurt that we don't even know. And whenever you have a place where all those values bump into each other, it's a stressful place to be, but that there really are, we're also not the first people to live on planet Earth and navigate these issues, and that there really are resources and tools that can help us figure out in this particular situation which value sort of speaks the loudest and what do I have to do. And again, to what I'm taking away with me as well is the concept of when am I allowed not to say something? That it's not only about being allowed to speak, but also that in situations where we know something that really could be setting someone up for a lot of pain and a lot of devastation, that there might be a real obligation to speak. And that's why, when in doubt, ask. And while it's easier to hope that someone else gets the call, to know that part of being part of Klal Yisrael and part of a community is that we are all responsible for each other. And we have these obligations to help each other with the information that we might know and have learned in the course of knowing someone.
Right.
So we welcome, thank you so much, Rabbi Cohen, for giving us so much of your time and for all of the thought and time and energy that you put into researching all of this and pulling it together for us. And I want to also thank Sarah, who directs our educational programming at Shalom Task Force. And thank you for everything you've done to make this possible. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We know this is a busy season. Yontif is coming. I think I'm in denial as to how soon it's coming, but we know that it's a busy time of year. We appreciate you sharing your time with us. We would welcome your feedback on this program and follow-up questions that you have for future programs. And really thank you for spending your evening with us. And may we all go into the next year with that increased awareness of how make it or break it our speech can be, for good, for bad, to help people, to harm people, and that we'll all use our powers of speech and information to really help make our community a safe and happy and healthy place. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.